Hello, everyone. Welcome to Unlocking Potential, Finding Hidden Gems Through DEI and Skills. My name is Shaylin Herrick. I am the Solution Leader for Technology Hiring here at SHL. And if you're not familiar with SHL, just a little bit about us. We are the leader in people science globally, helping over 10,000 organizations support various use cases from volume hiring to early grad hiring to technology hiring across talent acquisition and talent management. And I am joined today by my fantastic colleague, Lucy Adler.
Hi everyone, my name's Lucy and I am the Inclusion and Engagement Director here at SHL. I've spent the last kind of 10, 12 years in the DEI space, helping organisations on their DEI journey. So really excited for this conversation today.
So we're going to hit three key topics today. The first one is going to be whose responsibility is DEI? Is it an individual's? Is it a group's within the organization? How do you ensure success and who's responsible for that? The second thing we'll talk about is why candidate and employer perceptions of inclusion in hiring differ so dramatically. And last but not least, some practical things that hiring teams can do to improve inclusion in hiring and mobility within the organization. And of course, we will also try and leave time for your questions. So please don't be shy. Please put them in the comments section here. And we look forward to this discussion with you all. So let's start out with that first question here. We'd love to know, who do you think should be responsible for DEI? We want to hear from the group here, and then we want to discuss and talk about what your feelings are. Is it an individual? Is it a group of people? And why? Tell us a little bit more about why you think certain folks are responsible in certain roles. Do they have the authority? Do they have the right agency in order to be responsible for the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization?
So hopefully you can see the Menti up on screen there. So if you scan that QR code, or if you go to menti.com and pop in the code on screen, it should bring you up with a lovely word cloud. We're just looking for your answers on who do you think should be responsible for all things DEI?
And while we're thinking about that, why would that individual be responsible for DEI within the organization, and how might they measure their success?
It's the age-old question, and we should say there's no right or wrong answers. We're not going to be, scoring these and reporting back to your bosses. We're genuinely curious to know, what your thoughts are on this topic.
Yeah. So we're hearing everyone is responsible. Leaders should drive it. HR, leaders.
Definitely seeing everyone. The biggest word there, which is must mean that's the most common response from people.
Yeah. Every department, maybe we're saying every team leader on every department. Everyone continues to grow and we're seeing management leads by example. Yep. As Lucy said, no wrong answers here. We want to know what you're experiencing in your day-to-day.
So,
all right.
Yeah, keep those coming in. We're going to come back to using Menti later. So I'm glad people are actually listening and getting involved, which is great. Let me share kind of some of my thoughts on whose responsibility it should be. And I'm not surprised that the kind of top answer there was everyone. But I do tend to see there's kind of phases that organisations go through on their DEI journey. And I think it would be naive to underestimate the importance of that leadership and buy-in from the top, right at the top, in particular the CEO, because if that's not something that's on the priority for the board of directors, for the leadership of your organization, you're really going to struggle to kind of create change. So I do see organizations kind of go through almost 3 different phases, and I've heard somebody refer to them as kind of DEI 1.0, 2.0 and 3.0, and I'm sure there's various iterations, 1.5s, 2.75s in between. But I think 1.0 for me is that kind of meeting the legal obligations. Now, obviously, this changes from country to country, region to region. In the UK, we have the Equality Act. Some countries don't really have any legislation around this. So that might mean that DEI isn't initially a big priority for that country, but it's kind of the bare minimum stay out of jail stuff. And then you kind of start to reach this 2.0, which is sort of often defined by this acknowledgement that there are imbalances. Your kind of diversity of your organization might not quite be where you want it to be, particularly when you look at senior roles. It's often very data driven, where people are really trying to understand, well, how diverse are we as an organization? How inclusive are we as an organization? And if we understand that data, what can we do? Where should we be? And what can we do to get to where we want to be? So often you'll see organizations perhaps setting representation goals or representation ambitions, where they'll very publicly state things like, you know, we want to get to 50% of senior roles held by women by a certain time frame. And there'll be programs and activities that underpin how they're going to reach those goals. That's really where the kind of concept of this equity comes in. So it's not necessarily about giving, you know, the same interventions to the same groups of people. You know, sometimes we think in order to be fair, we have to give everybody the same thing. But that's where equity differs from equality. It's about recognizing the differences that exist between different groups, that different groups might need different interventions to get to that same end point as everyone else. And then 3.0 is, I feel like, where we're all, you know, people who have been through this journey are then thinking, right, how do we get to a place where DEI is just so embedded in everything that we do? It's just part of our culture and our DNA as a company. One of the things I always say about my role is that if I'm doing my job right, in kind of 3, 4, 5 years' time, we shouldn't need an inclusion director. It should be so embedded into how things work. It's in our systems, it's in our processes, it's in our policies. But for me, the interesting point about this 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 journey is you can't really just skip straight to the end. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, if we could all just go straight to 3.0 and we were really confident that the makeup of our organizations really reflected the makeup of society. Everybody was inclusive. We were getting all those great benefits that we know the research tells us come from having diverse, psychologically safe teams, and we could just get there. And unfortunately, it's not that easy. So I think a lot of organizations at the moment are perhaps in that space of, we've got some great ambitions in terms of representation, we've got some great initiatives underway, but how do we get to that point where things just feel like they're embedded? There is another population that I want to kind of talk about where, and I saw a couple of people sort of allude to it in the word cloud around sort of team leaders and managers. And I think quite often in organisations, I see really great buy-in to all things DEI at the very top level. And then we'll have some really passionate colleagues on the ground who are, trying to make things happen. Maybe they're part of employee resource groups. And then there's this layer in the middle of that, maybe that team leader or that kind of first line manager role that plays such a big role on the day-to-day experience of colleagues. So I think there's been so many different studies around this, and 70% always seems to be the number that I come across on various different studies that basically say things like 70% of an individual's employees' feelings of happiness at work, of colleague engagement, of whether they feel safe to be themselves, are influenced directly by their one-to-one relationship with their direct line manager. So this is a population that has a huge influence over how people feel when they come to work. But for me, they're also a population that have more and more demands on them. So sometimes as organisations, we're not great at thinking about what is it that we're looking for when we promote people into that manager space. What's the training and support we give them to go from being maybe an individual contributor who was brilliant at their jobs to now suddenly managing and leading people? Yet they're getting lots of requests from their team. They're getting requests coming down the line. They're expected to be everything for everyone, and we're not always great at supporting them with that. So that for me is a key population when you're thinking about your DEI efforts, is around if you can unlock that population. One, are you promoting them properly in the first place? Are these people really equipped to be good leaders of people? And two, what support are you giving them? I think they are one of the keys to kind of creating an inclusive culture in organisations. So that kind of brings me to our next poll. So we would love to know for your organisation where you would say you are in your DEI journey. So if we can get the next poll up, Azra, that would be great. So again, we're using Menti for this, so you can scan the QR code or you can go to menti.com, enter the code 63824490 and let us know what you think. So where do you think your organisation is on their DEI journey? So we've got not started, just started, so perhaps starting to think in that 1.0, how are we meeting our legal obligations? Are you making progress? Maybe you've got some representation goals, maybe you've got some specific programs, or would you say you're mature? So maybe moving out of that 2.0 into that 3.0, starting to think about how it's embedded in your culture. So keep those coming in. Again, this is all completely anonymous. Not going to be kind of publishing who's saying what, just really interested to understand where people are at on their journey.
And if you haven't started yet, that's okay too.
Yep. Maybe attending this today is your first part of getting started on that journey.
And we hope that's true. We hope that you learned some things today about how to have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. So we're making a lot of progress.
Yeah, we've got most people either making progress, which is great to hear, or just started. So my next question for you is kind of considering where you are right now. What are some of the biggest challenges or barriers that are stopping you from moving to the next stage? So we're going to do this one as another word cloud to kind of give you the freedom to answer. So again, that should be popping up soon on your Menti. So thinking about the stage you're at the moment, what are the biggest kind of barriers or challenges that are stopping you from moving to that next stage? Or even if you're kind of more towards the making progress, when you were starting out, what were some of those challenges that you had to overcome?
So it looks like everybody's got the hang of it, but the Menti code there is how you will enter. You can scan it, you can enter the code, whatever is easiest for you.
This is a different code to before, so you will need to rescan. It won't pop up. So you can either scan that QR code on the screen, or if you go to menti.com this time, enter the code 789426.2.
Tokenism. That's a really interesting idea and an interesting call out. What might blocking the organization to more mature execution of their DEI program?
New leadership is a really interesting one as well. I think particularly I talked earlier in that top level about really wanting to have buy-in at the very top. If all of a sudden your leaders change, or you get somebody with a very different idea and perspective of doing things, that can sometimes make you feel like you're going backwards on that journey as well.
Yeah, different ideas, different perspective, as well as different priorities. When leaders come into new roles, sometimes that can shift.
Exactly. Funding, yes, absolutely. a big one as well. I think funding and time and resources, I would add that all into the same bucket as well. So we wanted to kind of start today with some practical things, and obviously from an SHL perspective, one of the things that we look to do is really help people on their inclusion journeys in kind of two spaces. So one is around hiring, and the other is around kind of talent management. So I guess if we start with hiring, Shailin, I'd love to hear from you. You work with lots of different customers where we're helping them in this space. So what have you seen work really well when it comes to inclusive hiring? What have the most successful companies looked like?
Well, as we just saw and just discussed, they absolutely have an eye towards inclusion and diversity in the leadership level. So that often plays out in two really critical ways. One is that things like psychological safety, connection, and communication are really encouraged and enabled within the organization. And then the second, which really helps our middle managers, that really important population, are systemic frameworks that are both visible and measurable, but also serve a very, very clear purpose. So we can have all of these great ideas of what we want our culture within the organization to look like and act like, and the behaviors that we use. And we can think about those, we can talk about those, we can be really purposeful and intention. But if we don't have frameworks within the organization that support every employee, from the individual contributor all the way up to the CEO, that everyone understands and everyone agrees upon, then it's going to be very, very hard to realize those behaviors on a consistent and routine basis. And those are the kinds of things that get you to move along on that DEI maturity scale. So this can include things like very clear and consistent career pathing, mobility opportunities. In order to have those, clear job descriptions are necessary, and fair job descriptions too, I should add, that they don't include any exclusionary language. Compensation structures and visibility to how those work across regions, across role levels, those are important. And last but not least, truly structuring the hiring process. This is an issue that kind of is pervasive across different types of organizations, different industries, but in technology hiring in particular, which is typically where I work with organizations who are hiring software engineers and other technical talent, but also other professional job families, there's a lot of disparity in how hiring has been done and the tools that have been used in order to do it, but also the measurement that is used to determine how to take action. So over time, organizations often find that they've kind of like built these very big hiring programs that include lots of different tools or maybe even no tools at all. And the outcome from using all those different things is inconsistent and it's disparate. And I think I'm probably saying something very familiar to the group that is on this call today. When you have inconsistency, that is the opportunity for bias to seep in. And last but not least, these kind of systemic frameworks in hiring, as well as internal career growth and how teams are led, really support that middle manager. So if your organization doesn't necessarily have some plans and some frameworks and practices in place to support those middle managers, it's probably a good time to start talking about that. It's a very strategic and important conversation to have that will help your business grow. And I kind of want to like stay on that thread of hiring and why hiring has the opportunity to shape a culture. But also, Lucy, you attended the Black Young Professionals Conference last week, and a very interesting topic came up a few times, and that was the perception of hiring processes, and in particular, assessment in the hiring process, how that might differ very significantly from the candidate to the employer. And while there have been positive changes made, maybe those perceptions haven't quite aligned. What are you seeing, and what was your reaction to that, and how employers might be able to optimize that perception?
Yeah, I think first up, the interesting thing to note is I've definitely seen a shift over the last few years around candidates' expectations from their employers, both as kind of an inclusive employer in general, but also using the recruitment process as a chance to really test if that employer is as inclusive as they say they are. So I was reading a study recently which talked, I think it was, they did a survey of people who were out in the market looking for jobs, and they were looking at like, what's the most important thing to you when you're potentially considering joining a new company? And 75% of people who answered said the company's commitment to DEI was a really important decision-making factor. And that rose to 83% when they looked at the kind of Gen Z respondents. So I think now we have this generation who are entering the workforce who have much higher expectations. I think gone are the days where we would have these, big grand graduate programs, and it was really that fierce competition to get in, and candidates would sort of be like, I just want to work for this organization because of its reputation. Now it's much more of a two-way street where candidates are putting organizations under a lot more scrutiny around their expectations. So yeah, I was at the amazing BYP Leadership Conference last week. So SHL have just recently partnered with BYP for 2 years. And this was really our first chance to meet some of their members. And so we had our little booth there, and I could see most people, they would approach us, and there were booths from all the other sponsors who were quite well-known companies here in the UK. And they would sort of get to SHL, and I could see them looking at our logo thinking, have I heard of this company? Should I know who they are? We were right next to Morgan Stanley, which is like a big investment bank here in the UK, but like very recognizable. And my sort of first question to people would be like, oh, hello, like I'm from SHL. Have you heard of SHL before? Most of the time they'd be like, no, I don't think I have. You sort of look familiar. I don't know why. And then I would say, have you ever been asked to do an online assessment as part of a recruitment process, as part of applying for a job? And 9 times out of 10, it was like, oh, yeah, I have. I hate those things, one person said to me. And I had to say, like, I'm really sorry. That's our fault. We are one of the organizations behind that like specializes in the science behind those assessments. And I think your point there around sometimes as an organization, we are trying to be, we think, great, we're going to remove a lot of bias from our decision making. And we've got these assessments, which are great. But when a candidate is asked to do one of those assessments, actually, it's still quite a stressful experience for them. There's still quite a lot of mistrust. How is this assessment going to, really decide whether I could do this job or not that I'm applying for? So I think actually one of the things that SHL are trying to do is, and the reason we partnered with BYP is to get under the skin of some of those reactions. We've created what we're calling an inclusive assessment research program. This started in the neurodiversity space, and now we're expanding it, where we just really want to understand what can we do with the experience of taking our assessments to make them feel more inclusive. Now, don't get me wrong. It's a bit like saying, we're never going to change, we're never going to get the, oh, yes, great, I'd love to take this online test reaction from a candidate. But I would really like to turn it from a, oh, I hate those things, to a, okay, I'm curious about this, and let's do it and let me learn about myself. So I think there's some really interesting things in there where alongside our customers, we can work to kind of change that perception. And one of the important things, and I think this applies throughout the hiring process, is just being really clear about what's happening and why. If you're inviting somebody to an interview, giving them information. I think gone are the days where we're trying to catch people out, deliberately make them feel uncomfortable. It's giving that information up front around what's happening and sharing, we're asking you to take this online test. We believe it's fair. It's backed by this science. Here's why we want to make this part of our decision-making process. And actually that was sort of the basis of one of the sessions we were running, which was like behind the scenes of psychometrics. And my colleague Estelle kind of put it beautifully around how else would you want somebody to be making a decision on whether you're good at the job? Do you want that decision to involve data, science, objectiveness? Or do you want it to be because the interviewer made a snap second first impression, or you mentioned that you went to the same school that they have a connection with, or you play at the same golf club that and these are the types of systems that have been in place for years, where actually decisions haven't been made objectively. So really interesting differences in those perceptions at the moment.
And I think something else that's interesting about assessment is that the common thought is that assessment is good for the employer, and the employer is the primary beneficiary of that information. But on the other hand, assessment can also reveal to a candidate that they have a skill that they didn't know that they had. Like perhaps they actually show traits for strong leadership capability, or they're a strong analytical thinker. But if they haven't had the opportunity in the past to demonstrate those kinds of skills and also get the feedback from a manager who cares about them and who is really listening, observing to see what they can do, they just might not know that they can do those things. And therefore they may not have highlighted it. And I think it kind of leads us to the idea of being intentional versus unintentional in your hiring processes, and also just how you manage talent within your organization. Being unintentional leads into that opportunity for bias, a pretty significant opportunity for bias. We want to try to measure, audit, and eliminate those wherever possible. Hiring just happens to be one that is very, very public.
Yeah. Exactly. And what's really interesting is the whole theme of that BYP conference was intentional steps. So what are the intentional, and I think that applies to individuals. What are the intentional steps you're taking to manage your career, but also organizations? What are the intentional steps you're taking to bring diversity into your organization, and make sure that diverse voices are heard, feel safe, can flourish, thrive, build careers in your organization.
Yeah. I love that.
So I read a really interesting report today. I think it came out just last week. So every year, McKinsey do publish their Women in the Workplace report. And it kind of looks at the intersectionality between gender and race and ethnicity. And it's one of the biggest studies that's done every year. I think they have kind of thousands of participants from hundreds of different companies. And they have this phrase that I just think explains kind of some of the obstacles in this space so well. And it's what they call the broken rung. So the kind of myth is the biggest barrier to women's advancement in the workplace is this glass ceiling. And actually what the phrase they've coined is the reality is it's not the ceiling, it's the broken rung. So for the 9th consecutive year, this study has found that women face their biggest hurdle at that first critical step up into a manager position. And this year they found that for every 100 men promoted from entry level to manager, 87 women were promoted. And the gap is growing. So in the wrong way. So it's not closing, it's getting bigger. For women of colour, it was 73 women for every 100 men. And basically what they're saying is this broken rung of the first step mean that women are always constantly falling behind when it comes to promoting up the levels and they can't catch up. So, and I think it's such a great kind of metaphor of it. That first step is so much harder. So I'd really love to understand from you, I guess, when we're thinking not just about hiring, but also kind of promoting, how can objective assessment and structured interviewing help us with that broken rung problem? And how can we make sure when we're thinking about skills versus experience that we're getting the right mix in there? Because one of my frustrations is I speak to a lot of leaders who say, Lucy, I would just love to have more diversity in my team. I'm just not getting diverse candidates apply. And then I look at things, around their job adverts, and I see things like, I need to have 10 years plus experience in XYZ. I need to have this particular grade from these types of universities in this particular field of academic study. And it's kind of, you're just narrowing the pool of talent straight away before you've even started. So I feel like I've talked at you for a long time and given you loads of questions to answer. I would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. Let's portion it into kind of a two-part answer. The first is about talent acquisition, how we get those folks in the door and get them in seat into great roles. And then the second is about how do we manage them internally and how do we give them the right opportunities? And those two things they're very much related historically, but I think this is changing. But historically, organizations have really separated those activities. And now it seems like talent acquisition and talent management are kind of coming together around consistent assessment data and also consistent interviewing processes, because they're realizing that there really is no difference. Once the individual is in seat, that assessment data that was generated in the hiring process can be very, very useful to understand like who they are how ready they are to do the specific job, what potential behaviors they can exhibit on the job so that they can get to that next step. And also what kind of fit might they have for this particular role, but maybe other roles within the organization too. Only 1 in 5 organizations actually consider their hiring and skills mobility processes, career mobility process to be skills-based, which is really surprising. And getting that objective data is absolutely step one. So when we think about sourcing and how this starts at the very, very top of the funnel, we do want organizations and encourage organizations to be really purposeful in where they source talent from and how proactive they are in doing so from different populations. Like this is why career fairs and conferences are a really great thing. Becoming partners and members with organizations like the National Society for Black Engineers here in the United States provides access to diverse technical talent. And in technology hiring, that's often something that we hear is, like, to Lucy, to your point, like, we don't get enough applicants that are diverse. It doesn't represent the population that ultimately we want to hire. But organizations have to be a little bit more intentional. They have to be more focused. They have to go to those folks in order to explain what is exciting about their company, why they should believe and understand that they're going to be treated fairly in the hiring process, but also once they're on the job. There are good reasons to have those conversations, and organizations ought not be shy about them. Let people know that there are good things in store for them once they're in seat within the company. And that's kind of, coming back to the connection of talent acquisition and talent management. We're also seeing a lot of organizations, because they did not use objective assessment for hard skills, soft skills, or personality, or potentially other skills within the hiring process, they're now going back to the individuals and saying, self-report to me, fill out this assessment on what you think your skills are. And then your hiring manager, or whoever the manager on your team is going to kind of cross-check that and go, yeah, I agree, disagree, whatever that response might be. And the problem with that is that it of course can let bias seep in. Those responses and those judgments from a team leader can be very, very disparate. If assessment is turned internally, which we're starting to see more and more of, then that fairness that is expressed and expected in the hiring process can also be brought into career pathing, career growth, and mobility. In fact, a study that we just did indicates that about 66% of organizations who are hiring technical talent actually do use assessments, both for the hiring process as well as internally for career pathing and career growth and identification of how to apply learning and development programs to certain groups, which I was really excited and really heartened to see.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's so important to start bringing together, if we're using some of these objective assessments and we're really getting to know people as part of the talent acquisition process and the recruitment process, is why should that stop when somebody then joins the organization? Because it's, we should then be using everything we've learned to set somebody up for a successful career. And actually in the comments, Nozi, I hope I'm saying your name right, Nozi, has made a really interesting point around, quite often if you're unsuccessful, you don't get any feedback on the assessment. So it's actually then really difficult to learn about yourselves and perhaps take that to a future application. So I think that's definitely something that we are trying to work with our customers on around. If somebody's taken the time, sometimes you have to do more than one, right? We're asking people to do quite a few of these assessments. And I know when I've taken them, I'm like, oh, I wonder what this is going to say about me. That's really disheartening if you then don't get any sort of feedback or report off the back of that. So I think, yeah, there's definitely some more learning that we can do in that space. I think the other interesting thing you touched on is one of the things that I see happening quite a lot in organizations when they're looking at their DEI strategies is they put all of their attention into the recruitment space. I must bring more diversity into my organization, but ultimately that is not setting yourself up for sustainable change, because what will happen very quickly is if you don't have the right culture, you're going to be having people leave as quickly as they're joining. You're never going to shift the dial and change that balance. So it's really important to be thinking about actually what is the culture for people joining. I think I mentioned it before, all of those business cases and research studies that we see around the benefits that diversity brings to an organization. you don't unlock those benefits unless you actually, it's not just about creating a seat at the table. You have to make it safe for voices to be heard. You have to make people feel like they can be heard. It's that psychological safety and the underlying culture of the organization that's really important as well.
Yeah. And if you consider that an organization may have an attrition rate of like 10 to 15%, you feasibly cannot focus on that 10 to 15% population that is going to come in on an annual basis to shift the makeup of your organization and make that population of your organization really reflect what the real world looks like. That's just going to be very, very difficult to do, and it's going to take a very long time. No matter how good you are at changing the culture from perhaps the top down within the org.
So I think we promised we would leave some time for questions. We would love to hear your questions on this topic. Have there been things we've said maybe you don't agree with? Would love to hear that as well. Anything you'd like to hear more about? Please do just pop your questions in the comments. Just leave it as a LinkedIn comment. Like I can see some of you have done that already. So we would love to hear a bit more about that. Whilst you're doing that, I do want to talk a little bit about our kind of inclusive assessment program, which I touched on earlier. And I sort of briefly mentioned this all started in the kind of neurodiversity space. So a few years ago, we were getting lots of questions from our customers around, okay, we've been using your assessments as part of our recruitment process for a number of years, but are they suitable for neurodiverse candidates? What should I be doing if somebody has dyslexia or ADHD or ASD? Is it okay for me to ask them to complete one of these assessments? And we looked to see, okay, what does the research say, which is always our first port of call whenever we get questions like this. What does the research say? So that we can make sure that our advice is backed in research. And we found there was very, very little to kind of no research in this space. So back in 2018, we launched our neurodiversity research program to answer some of those very questions. And we found some really interesting things, which have kind of helped us bust a few myths. So I think the classic answer in this space was just give people more time. Just give them more time to complete the assessment. And actually, that didn't always make a difference. There were also some misconceptions that actually probably neurodiverse candidates wouldn't do as well as neurotypical candidates. Mm-hmm. And again, we found that not to be true. If anything, neurodivergent candidates were outperforming neurotypical candidates. But what we did find was kind of what we call small changes make a big difference. And this is where we come into this inclusive assessment space, was that actually the experience of taking a test could have been so much better. So one of the things that always sticks in my mind is the timer, especially as I can see a little timer on my screen of how long we've been going for. And some candidates, as part of our research, told us they loved seeing the timer, kept them on track, and they were able to kind of make sure that they were planning their time appropriately. And other candidates said it was a massive distraction, put too much pressure on them. All they could concentrate on was the timer ticking away, and they would get quite fixated on it. So small but meaningful change that we're building into some of our platforms is just the ability to minimize that timer. It's there if you need it, and if it's helpful to you, if it's too distracting, you can take it away. And I think that is a great example of this kind of small but meaningful change that actually, whilst this has come out of our neurodiversity research program, will go on to make a much more inclusive experience for all of the candidates, the millions of candidates that take SHL assessments over the course of a year. And we're now looking at, okay, what about other underrepresented demographics in the workplace, and how can we explore how they both perform and experience our assessments? So I think always constantly trying to evolve, make sure we're being as inclusive as possible. One of the things I'm really mindful of is we are a small part of a very big system that decides who gets promoted, who gets hired, and we need to make sure that we're not inadvertently disadvantaging underrepresented groups. So really excited where this research program is going.
You mentioned something important that I want to make sure doesn't get missed, and that is that inclusion in the hiring process and within the organization really is good for everybody. If we find the change that is going to improve outcomes and improve comfort for a certain population, it certainly isn't going to hurt anybody else. It's absolutely going to improve prediction. It's going to improve hiring funnel throughput. All of those things are good, which organizations sorely want in many cases where there's still a lack of candidates for certain job roles with certain niche skills. I mean, how often do you think that inclusion and prediction are really linked when thinking about talent strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for too long, which is why we see the kind of stats that we see in most organizations, talent strategy has been very subjective. I've absolutely worked in organizations that have used that 9-box model, and I've been part of teams where we've sat around and we've talked about people, and if I'm being kind, I could say that, really well-intentioned leaders would, look at the actual work and the deliverables and, have a think about which one of those 9 boxes people in their team should fit in. But I think that would be me being very, very kind and generous. There is a better way, a way that's actually based on science and data that really helps to predict potential. And that's the great thing about looking at skills and using those as a way to actually measure potential, which for such a long time has been so subjective and basically been about, well, how well do I get on with my boss? So I think there is just so much more space, and that will lead to a much more inclusive experience. And I think for people, once they're in organizations as well as employees and colleagues, I mean, how many times I know I've experienced this where someone's kind of your boss has maybe been like, oh yeah, we have this talent review and you're this and you're on the succession plan for this role, and you're thinking like, well, what, how, why? Sometimes they don't even tell you, and then I know I would much rather be on the receiving end of a conversation where it's like, hey, remember you took this assessment a few weeks ago, here were the outcomes of that, here's where we see your potential, here's your learning style, let's work together to build a development plan based on this. So I just think there's so much kind of scope for improvement, particularly in that talent management space. I think we're seeing it get much better in the recruitment space, but in that talent management space, there's still a lot of room for bias and subjectivity to creep in.
Yeah. And so much of it is because organizations commonly don't measure these kinds of outcomes. Like you can't improve what you don't measure, right? And it is difficult and often viewed as a barrier because, number one, teams are commonly thinking, well, we've done things the same way forever and ever and ever. We don't want to try to change it. We don't have data to prove that we should change it, and that doing so will generate the kind of outcomes that we require. But there's a kind of skip in the logic in between, right? Like you do have to take that step to start measuring what you plan to improve. And that's something that I think I've seen organizations and I've seen team leaders do at a smaller level. So an engineering manager, maybe with a team of 20, can absolutely start measuring these things on their own and create their own use cases and their own business cases to go back to the organization and say, this way that I did it actually did improve outcomes. I worked with my TA business partner. I worked with my learning and development business partner in order to enact this plan. Middle managers. I think we're coming full circle back to how incredibly important that group is, and absolutely should be supported with systemic fairness and framework making themselves successful in the organization.
Absolutely.
And before we close out, we do want to make sure that there are opportunities for folks to ask any questions. It's a safe space. Anything you want, we're here to answer. Or alternatively, if you don't want to ask in this forum and you do want to reach out to us later on, you absolutely can do so on LinkedIn.
Please do.
So as we close out, Lucy, perhaps you can tell us what would you say to companies who are still at the early part of their DEI journey? For those that are here today, hoping to go back to their organization with one, maybe two things that they could start to do, what would you say?
Yeah. We could do a whole nother LinkedIn Live just on this. One of the best bits of advice that I was given is, in this space, you can do anything. There is so many different ways you can take your DEI strategy, so many different underrepresented groups or themes that impact everybody. You could do anything, but you can't do everything. Like, we have to be realistic around, we're all in organizations right now there are finite resources. We saw all of those things come up earlier: budget, resources, change of leadership. So you can do anything, but you can't do everything. So what are the one or two things that you think will make the biggest difference in your organization? And start with those. And to your point, Shailene, think about the things that are really going to kind of have the biggest impact systemically. So we saw that word tokenism earlier. It's really easy to kind of spin up okay, we're going to do International Women's Day, we're going to do something for Pride, and that will tick those boxes. Those types of things are really important, but they need to be part of a bigger program that's, say, looking at overall education. Maybe it's I'm going to do something for International Women's Day just for our middle managers as a starting point and a platform to get them interested in inclusion. That's where it moves from that tokenism or tick box into something more meaningful. Which kind of brings me to my next point, is when you're doing anything in this space, you need to really prioritize the voices of employees in your organizations that are from underrepresented demographics. There's a great phrase which is kind of like nothing for us without us. So getting input, buy-in, giving people agency, empowering people who are from those underrepresented demographics to be part of the change you're looking to create. That can be really difficult, back to that point of, you will get so many ideas, you will get so many people coming to you around, this is what's wrong, or needs help, this needs fixing. You can't do everything at once, but you need to have really clear communication around what it is you are trying to do. And hopefully all of that together will help you kind of create meaningful systemic change, but it takes time, and you need patience. And sometimes it will feel like perhaps you're going a few steps back, but ultimately take the time to look back every 6 months or so and see how far you've come, because in the times where it feels like you're going 3 steps backwards, looking back over the longer term will help you remember the change that you're trying to create and where you might be in another 6 months' time.
This is very sound advice. Also, in a time where things are chaotic, that will definitely help keep you sane.
Exactly.
Well, I think that about wraps us up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. If you do have feedback on the session, there is a QR code here where you can input that feedback. And again, absolutely find us on LinkedIn. You can reach out to us there. We look forward to continuing this conversation in many other forums. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much.